Spider-Man is one of the most important superheroes in the history of modern comic books, and has served as one of Marvel's flagship titles for most of the company's history. The character is beloved by many for his unique set of superpowers, the personal struggles that he has to face as an ordinary person gifted with such powers, and for having one of the greatest rogues galleries in Marvel's lineup. The character is the most well-known in the company's history, and has received the greatest amount of media adaptations out of any character at Marvel's disposal. Naturally, this includes movie adaptations. Across 5 films, the Spider-Man franchise is the most profitable in the superhero genre in terms of worldwide box office sales. What you might not know, however, is the trouble that it took to bring the character to the screen for the first time, and some of the behind-the-scenes drama that has encompassed the most recent 2 films in the franchise. Today, we'll be talking about both the failed and successful attempts to get a Spider-Man movie made, the reboot that led to the creation of both the Amazing Spider-Man movies, and the complications that Sony faced after the release of the sequel. Spider-Man's history on the big screen is far and away the most extensive out of any Marvel character, with plans to bring the character to the screen going all the way back to the days of Richard Donner's Superman films. In fact, the first 2 actually predate Superman the movie, both of which were made as part of 2 separate television series. The first was the 2-hour pilot episode for the short-lived The Amazing Spider-Man television series, which was largely faithful to the original character. The second, a spin-off film based on Toei's Spider-Man, took more than a few creative liberties with the source material. But even with this in mind, no effort to make a Spider-Man movie that was specifically created with the film format in mind would come about for another few years. At that point, interest had faded when Superman 3 underperformed. Nonetheless, this would not stop production on a Spider-Man film. The first attempt to make a Spider-Man movie set for the big screen was to be helmed by B-movie director Roger Corman. It was Corman who would later go on to work on Marvel's The Fantastic Four, which would never see an official release. Corman's option, however, expired, leaving Marvel to seek out the attention of another studio, Cannon Films. The property was given over to producers Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus, who would recruit Tobe Hooper, the director of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, to direct the film, and Leslie Stevens, best known for his work on The Outer Limits, to come up with a script. However, Golan and Globus seriously misinterpreted the character of Spider-Man, thinking that he was a man who would transform into a spider-like monster rather than a superhero. The pitch that they had in mind would best be described as an odd hybrid of 2 cult-favorite horror movies, the body horror of David Cronenberg's remake of The Fly, and the disfigurement and revenge narrative of Brian De Palma's Phantom of the Paradise. Peter Parker would be a photographer exposed to nuclear radiation by a corporate scientist, transforming him into a hairy 8-armed mutant. He would then be kidnapped by the scientist in order to join a race of similarly mutated individuals that the scientist had created. However, unlike the others, Peter would retain his conscience and choose to fight off the army of mutants, eventually challenging the scientist himself. Spider-Man co-creator Stan Lee was unhappy with this departure from the source material, and requested that a film closer to the comics he wrote be made. To this end, Hooper was replaced by Joseph Zito, and a new script was written by Ted Newsom and John Brancato, and later revised by Barney Cohen. In the movie, Otto Octavius would have been Peter Parker's professor and mentor at a university, but an incident with experimental technology gone wrong turned Otto into Dr. Octopus and Peter into Spider-Man. A budget of $15 to $20 million was allocated to the film, and the search for a cast began. A promotional teaser was even made for the movie while it was in pre-production.
Within this unsuspecting city, history's greatest experiment creates tomorrow's greatest superhero. Spider-Man, the movie. A live-action spectacular directed by Joe Zito, based on the characters created by Stan Lee.
Tom Cruise was courted to play Spider-Man and Bob Hoskins to play Dr. Octopus. Stan Lee also asked if he could play J. Jonah Jameson, as he had based the character on how he believed his co-workers at Marvel perceived him. Other actors that were looked at for potential roles include Peter Cushing and Katharine Hepburn. Production on the movie was halted after Superman 4: The Quest for Peace was a critical and commercial failure, leading to the budget of the film being cut in half, director Zito leaving, and several rewrites taking place that Spider-Man stuntman Scott Leva, would describe as terrible. The movie was eventually canceled entirely due to Canon's financial troubles, and the rights would shift over too. Eventually, the rights moved to 21st Century Film Corporation, and then to Carolco Pictures after a copyright dispute. As a result of said dispute, Viacom would receive television rights to air the film, while Columbia Pictures, aka Sony, would gain the rights to distribute the film on home video. Various attempts to revive the movie based on the earlier drafts of the script would happen in subsequent years, with the most noteworthy attempt being done by Terminator director James Cameron, who reportedly looked into casting Leonardo DiCaprio as Spider-Man, Arnold Schwarzenegger as Dr. Octopus, and Nikki Cox as Mary Jane Watson. Cameron would later rewrite the script entirely, and featured Electro and Sandman as villains, and ultimately leading to a climax where Spider-Man would fight the villains atop the World Trade Center, and subsequently reveal his identity as Peter to Mary Jane, notably after the two had engaged in anonymous supercoitus on top of the Brooklyn Bridge. But yet again, production on the long-gestating Spider-Man movie would be delayed due to production troubles. This time, due to a dispute over Menachem Golan's then uncredited status in producing Cameron's film, led to lawsuits between Carolco, Viacom, Columbia, and 21st Century Film over the control of the Spider-Man film rights. Things hit rock bottom when the worst possible scenario occurred in 1996. Carolco, 21st Century Film, and Marvel all went bankrupt. The bankruptcy of 21st Century Film led to their financial assets being acquired by MGM, which included all of the scripts for hypothetical Spider-Man movies. MGM would then try to sue many of the parties involved to make the already complicated legal battle even more drastic. However, in 1998, Marvel recovered from bankruptcy with the aid of Toy Biz corporate owners Ike Perlmutter and Avi Arad, who licensed the film rights to multiple Marvel superheroes in order to keep the company afloat while restructuring occurred. With Marvel making the necessary rebound, the courts determined that Menachem Golan's original contract with Marvel had expired, meaning that the lawsuit itself no longer had grounds to stand upon and was thus forfeit. Perlmutter and Arad then licensed all of the film rights to Columbia Pictures, leading to what would become the first successful film adaptation of Spider-Man. Sony Pictures settled the remaining legal issues that MGM had by trading their James Bond film rights in exchange for MGM ceasing to take any further legal action. Sony then gained the rights to all of the previously completed scripts with the exception of the two that James Cameron worked on. With production on Marvel movies like Blade and X-Men underway with the supervision of Avi Arad, the stage was finally set for a Spider-Man movie to actually get made. A short list of directors included Roland Emmerich, Tony Scott, Chris Columbus, Ang Lee, Jan de Bont, M. Night Shyamalan, and David Fincher, the last of whom dropped out because he wanted to adapt The Night Gwen Stacy Died without having to tell an origin story. Sam Raimi was eventually selected as a director due to his dedication to the source material, and David Koepp was signed on to write. Raimi and Koepp drew many influences from Cameron's script, including bringing in biological web shooters instead of mechanical ones. Cameron's choices for villains were replaced with the Green Goblin and Dr. Octopus, though they filled out similar roles. Eventually, Dr. Octopus was written out entirely in order to keep the narrative focused on one villain and Spider-Man. Actors considered for the title role included Edward Furlong, Freddie Prinze Jr., Chris Klein, Wes Bentley, and Heath Ledger. Tobey Maguire eventually landed the role, and filming began in early 2001. Producer Avi Arad's Blade and X-Men were praised and commercially successful enough that both movies quickly gained sequels. But the superhero genre didn't quite catch on fire, with the year 2001 being completely free of a superhero movie of any kind. Everything changed with the release of the critically acclaimed blockbuster Spider-Man. The film grossed over $820 million and definitively marked the beginning of what is now referred to as the superhero boom that continues to this day. A sequel was quickly greenlit, with Dr. Octopus, the Lizard, and Black Cat all appearing as villains. This was quickly boiled down to Dr. Octopus, though Kurt Connors, the alter ego of the Lizard, would appear in the movie. The original plan was to have Dr. Octopus be around Peter's age and get into a love triangle with Mary Jane, but Arad vetoed this. Raimi opted to base the film around the Spider-Man No More arc, while also integrating elements of the Canon Films project into the story, particularly regarding Dr. Octopus's role. Like the first movie, Spider-Man 2 was a critical and financial success, making upwards of $780 million. Unfortunately, things started to go downhill with the production of Spider-Man 3. Raimi wanted to use the third film to bring closure to the Green Goblin story arc that the previous films had built up to, ultimately ending with Harry discovering that he wouldn't follow in his father's footsteps. Raimi had plans to use Sandman as the primary antagonist and Vulture, who would have been played by Ben Kingsley, as a secondary antagonist in a brief role, although the character was cut. It was at this time that Avi Arad pressured Sam Raimi into introducing Venom into the story, in order to build up a planned spin-off starring the anti-hero. While Arad claimed he insisted on Venom's inclusion to give the fans what he thought they wanted, Raimi was not a fan of the character. Raimi is rumored to have cast Topher Grace as the character as a way of spiting Arad, but Raimi has countered this with the argument that he liked Grace as an actor. In addition to shoehorning Venom into the story, the producers of the film also wanted Raimi to include Gwen Stacy in a romantic subplot, and Harry's story arc was now expanded to turn the character into a supervillain. An initial story that was envisioned as being a personal one, with Peter Parker learning to forgive Sandman and Harry for their crimes, quickly escalated into a story where Spider-Man had to fight a new Green Goblin, the Sandman, the symbiote, and Venom, in addition to running into a largely one-sided love triangle. At one point, the narrative of the film was even planned to be split between two movies due to the massive amount of content, but Sony wanted the story to be put into a single feature-length narrative. Naturally, this meant that the movie was destined to be lacking in focus due to having to juggle a number of subplots that were added by means of executive meddling. While Spider-Man 3 is still the most financially successful film in the entire franchise, with a worldwide gross of over $890 million, reviews for the film were decidedly more mixed for the lacking of cohesive plot structure that the other two films in the series had. Fan debates over whether or not the film is good persist today. When asked about the third movie years later, Raimi noted that, quote, "It just didn't work very well. I didn't really believe in all the characters, so that couldn't be hidden from the people who love Spider-Man." He also criticized himself and the creative team for not keeping a focus on, quote, "the characters and the relationships and progressing them to the next step, instead of trying to top themselves." In the meantime, Avi Arad's plan to appeal to fans by including Venom largely backfired, as many were disappointed in the character's limited amount of screen time and execution within the context of the story. Any progress on the planned Venom spin-off was stagnant after the release of the film. Many have mistaken the more critical reception of the third movie as the reason that the fourth was not made. However, the truth is that, for a time, a follow-up was planned for a 2011 release date. Sony's meddling continued well into Sam Raimi's planned Spider-Man 4. In fact, the amount of studio interference on the project actually increased substantially when compared to its predecessor. Raimi originally planned to go back to the format of having two villains. This time, the Lizard, whose alter ego Dr. Kirk Connors had already been introduced in the previous two films by actor Dylan Baker, and the Vulture played by John Malkovich. Raimi's request to use the Lizard was rejected on the grounds that the character's face wasn't human enough, so the character was planned to be introduced as a supervillain in Spider-Man 5. Felicia Hardy would have been introduced as a supporting character played by Anne Hathaway. And while Raimi has claimed she would have been Black Cat in the movie, when the film was actually in production, she was rumored to take the identity of Vulturess after Vulture had died earlier in the film. Sony insisted on introducing Carnage in the script as a way of setting up the Venom spin-off. Sony also wanted to capitalize on the newfound popularity of the 3D format after the release of Avatar by filming the movie in 3D instead of doing a conversion after filming had wrapped. The plot of Spider-Man 4 was said to be significantly more dark and depressing than any film that came before it. The story would have begun with Peter, now married to Mary Jane, with the pair raising a son, being evicted from their apartment due to a lack of funds. Fan-favorite actor J.K. Simmons would have had a much smaller role as J. Jonah Jameson due to the inclusion of the Vulture, as Adrian Toomes would have apparently bought out the Daily Bugle. Spider-Man would have then murdered the Vulture quite deliberately, inciting the wrath of his daughter Felicia, who would then become the primary antagonist that would wind up having an affair with Peter. Peter's marriage would be in tatters as a result of this, and Peter would not have custody of his son, causing him to give up being Spider-Man again in his depression, thus ending the movie on a pretty bleak note. Sam Raimi was said to have hated every single draft of the script that he had been given, a script that was revised at least 4 times, and this was one of the key reasons why the movie wasn't made. But unfortunately, the problems didn't stop there. Beyond Sony's meddling and story concerns was the biggest issue of all: the simple fact that the production of the movie was shaping up to be disastrous in spite of the talent involved. The movie was being rushed for a 2011 release date with a bloated script featuring a depressing storyline that would have most likely alienated audiences. The planned 3D filming meant that principal photography would have to start sooner in order to accommodate for the amount of time that would be needed to develop the footage. To make matters even worse, the movie's original release date was set to compete with another major superhero movie, Thor. And while that was an untested property, it was also one that Sony previously owned the film rights to for an unproduced movie. Even though Marvel Studios had not yet changed the game with the smash hit of The Avengers, Sony was conscious of the meteoric rise of the studio, especially after Disney had bought out Marvel. Last but not least, the movie was apparently going to be filmed alongside Spider-Man 5, which at that point didn't have a lot of creative resources being poured into it, and with Spider-Man 6 likely to have followed, would have significantly increased the workload placed upon the director. Ultimately disillusioned with the increasingly troubled project, and concerned that the movie would have to be significantly inferior to its predecessors in order to be made on time, Sam Raimi quit the movie. And without a director at the helm, the end for Spider-Man 4 was marked in January 2010. Fortunately for Sony, a contingency plan was already in place. As it stood, Spider-Man 3's 2007 release ensured that Sony could hang on to the property until at least 2015, before the rights would naturally revert back to Marvel Studios. This gave them plenty of time to begin production on another movie. Writer James Vanderbilt had already begun work on a reboot long before Spider-Man 4 was formally cancelled. This was to be used as the basis of the script for a rebooted version of the franchise, The Amazing Spider-Man. Avi Arad, who was the cause of the aforementioned creative issues with Spider-Man 3 and likely 4 as well, was lined up to produce the movie series alongside Matt Tolmach. Shortly after Raimi quit his run on the franchise, Sony Entertainment co-chairman Amy Pascal selected 500 Days of Summer director Mark Webb to direct the new film, which was publicly announced shortly afterward. Webb said that his movie was to be a reboot as opposed to a continuation with a different cast. In spite of this, Arad would insist that the movie was an interquel of some kind, likely fearing the negative connotations that the term reboot had. Shortly afterward, Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone were hired to play Peter Parker and Gwen Stacy. And while Garfield has his share of detractors, the couple would be commonly seen as the highlight of the films they would star in. Before we go on to describe the details of The Amazing Spider-Man's production, there's something that's extremely important to discuss beforehand. Sometime in 2011, Sony sold the live-action and animated Spider-Man television rights back to Marvel Studios in exchange for renegotiating the terms of the contract. Disney would gain control over all Spider-Man merchandise and the profits that would come with them, and Sony would get all of the profits off of the films. It should be noted that, according to Disney CEO Bob Iger, Marvel obtaining the merchandise was part of a purchase for an undisclosed amount of money. Even with the millions of dollars the sale would have given Sony, this seems like an extremely baffling move on Sony's end, since the merchandise is substantially more profitable than the films themselves. But this agreement does lay an important foundation to the formation of the deal made in 2015, which we'll discuss later. So while Sony wouldn't have to pay Marvel a cut of the profits their Spider-Man movies made, which also included home video, on-demand, and streaming revenues, Marvel would receive the massive amount of money that the merchandise would have generated. In other words, no matter what Sony would do in this situation, Marvel would ultimately profit from it. This agreement would serve as the key reason why Spider-Man was prominently featured in Disney's merchandise, television shows, and video games, while the Fox-owned characters, the X-Men and Fantastic Four, have been getting substantially less support. Sony, in the meantime, would not get as much as a dime from the Spider-Man merchandise sold, which made $1.3 billion annually. Back to The Amazing Spider-Man. The movie was initially conceived as being a less action-oriented and more of a character-driven superhero story, akin to Bryan Singer's Superman Returns, and would feature both Mary Jane and Gwen Stacy as love interests, though it was later revealed that Mary Jane would be written out of the film. Producer Avi Arad would reveal that the film's villain would be the Lizard, who he claimed was one of his favorite villains in spite of preventing Sam Raimi from using the character in Spider-Man 4. According to The Hollywood Reporter, In order to go for a more character-driven story, the movie was planned to have a reported budget of only $80 million. Nonetheless, the movie received a significant boost in its budget midway through production to add more action sequences, making it the second most expensive movie in the Spider-Man series at the time. Nonetheless, the gamble seemingly paid off for Sony when The Amazing Spider-Man was released to a mixed to positive reception. That being said, the most common complaint about the reboot was that it retread a number of existing plot points from the Sam Raimi movies in spite of the insistence that it would be a new story, something that Webb hoped to avoid in the sequels, by focusing on the newly introduced plot of the mystery behind Peter's parents and the conspiracy with Oscorp. Even with the nearly tripled budget of the reboot in mind, The Amazing Spider-Man would prove to be the most successful reboot of a franchise in history, making over $750 million worldwide. And while this was still a step down from the profits the previous movies made, it did show that Spider-Man could seemingly stand alone as a film property, independent from the rest of the greater Marvel Universe, as the Marvel Cinematic Universe received a huge boost in popularity when their crossover movie event, The Avengers, was released a few months earlier. Confident that the web slinger could stand on his own, Sony made it clear that there were no intentions to bring the character over to the Marvel Cinematic Universe through a cross-company deal. Thus, while production of a sequel was underway in 2013, Sony announced release dates for 2 subsequent sequels, with the plan seemingly being to go forward with a linear storyline akin to the Sam Raimi movies. However, plans shifted yet again when it was decided that the shared universe format that worked so well for the Avengers would be applied to Spider-Man, and that The Amazing Spider-Man 2 and its 2 sequels would serve as a launchpad for other spin-offs. 2 projects specifically named were a movie based on Sinister Six, a team of Spider-Man's foes, and a movie starring Venom, who would be a more anti-heroic take on the character. In addition, a female-led spin-off was also in development, though Sony never officially released information about who the movie would be about. There's a lot more to talk about here in regards to the many other movies that Sony had planned, but we'll be saving that for another video altogether. Due to the sudden shift between a planned 4-movie story arc and a shared universe format, director Mark Webb had his work cut out for him when The Amazing Spider-Man 2 had a lot more expected of it by the executives at Sony. As mentioned earlier, Webb wanted to set the films apart from the Raimi movies by tackling what happened with Peter's parents, and by using Oscorp as the source of empowerment of most of the superhumans in this setting. Sony, having plans to expand beyond Webb's planned narrative, tweaked the script to tease more potential leads for sequels and spin-offs, which came at the cost of developing the existing cast of characters and the movie's villains. Sony CEO Kaz Hirai was even said to have taken part in the editing process of the film, in spite of not having experience in such a field. The film itself had a great degree of behind-the-scenes meddling, and as a result, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was released to the worst reception out of any Spider-Man film, in addition to underperforming, even though the movie still grossed over $700 million. While Marvel were publicly supportive of Sony's film, in no small part to the merchandising deals Disney got out of it, Marvel's concerns were much more apparent behind the curtain. On September 17, 2012, Marvel Entertainment President Alan Fine noted a list of concerns that he had with the script for The Amazing Spider-Man 2 to Tom Cohen, who was the Vice President of Production at Marvel Studios. Some of his biggest gripes included claiming that Electro was underdeveloped as a character due to the presence of Rhino and Green Goblin, and that shoehorning the night Gwen Stacy died into the plot was unnecessary when it would have been better served in a sequel. Common criticisms shared by audiences when the film was released. Fine was also under the impression that the movie series was originally intended to be set in the same continuity as the original 3 films, this based on producer Avi Arad's comments. Fine also called Arad totally nuts for attempting to reboot a franchise so soon, even going as far as to say that he, quote-unquote, never knew what he was doing when he had control over other Marvel film franchises. Marvel Studios president Kevin Feige was also critical of the decision to reboot, as he noted to Fine that it would have made sense to build on a continuity that fits with the movie's framework, rather than to build a new continuity from the ground up. Feige cited the James Bond movies as an example of the framework he wanted to follow with the MCU, recasting key characters as necessary but continuing their existing story arcs. and he was baffled that Sony didn't consider implementing the same kind of plan. On November 19, 2013, Feige attempted to work things out with Sony in spite of his seemingly strained relationship with Robb by offering a number of suggestions that Sony could make to The Amazing Spider-Man 2 in post-production. Some of Feige's advice was heeded, such as removing an unnecessary time skip in the narrative and the removal of a scene that made pre-Electro Max Dillon come across as creepy and unsympathetic. However, many of his concerns, including concerns over the convoluted narrative, that the romantic arc was taking up too much of the running time, and that the retcon to Spider-Man's story of having Peter fated to become the web-slinger by his father were left ignored, and as both Feige and Fine discussed earlier, were widely criticized in the film itself. While the reason behind Sony ignoring some of the key suggestions that may have made for a better film may not be known, it's likely that more than a few were vetoed by the same producer who opted for a reboot in the first place. Robb and Feige seem to have had an odd working relationship over the years. Feige was originally brought into Marvel's movie-making process when Robb requested that he use his knowledge of the comics to help Bryan Singer and the production crew of the original X-Men movie. Feige would help executive produce a number of films that Robb also worked on, but things seem to have turned sour between the two of them after 2008, when Robb parted ways with Feige after the two produced the first two installments of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk. Since then, Robb has made the audacious claim that he was more influential in bringing the setting together than Feige was, in spite of Feige being the one to prove that crossovers could be hugely successful. Even more interesting is that Robb was firmly anti-crossover prior to the success of the Avengers, to the point where he made it difficult for any company outside of Marvel to make a crossover with the franchises that they owned. Robb bitterly noted that he believed crossing Spider-Man over with the Avengers would indicate that he would be running out of ideas as a producer, even though he had the same intent to cross the character over with the Sinister Six, Venom, and other potential film franchises connected to the Spider-Man property. He also noted that he would only approve of an Avengers crossover if Spider-Man took precedence over the other characters, even though Avengers stories, where Spider-Man is included, usually only feature the character in a supporting role. As it stands, it appears as though Marvel Studios do not want to associate themselves with Robb. Behind the scenes, it would come to light that Amy Pascal also had similar sentiment about Robb, noting directly in a private email that, quote, Avi needs to take a back seat, end quote, in regards to the Amazing Spider-Man 2 sequels and spin-offs. Pascal also noted in this conversation that she was struggling to find a way to tell him that someone else needed to take care of planning the franchise, with the implication being that he should simply focus on gathering the necessary resources for the filmmakers to tell their stories instead of allowing him to interfere with creative matters. James Horner, the composer behind the first film, stated that he refused to return for the sequel due to the influences of the producers over Mark Webb's vision. His key complaint was that the producers simply wanted more and more action over a cohesive story, and he noted that the plot in the second movie's script was, quote-unquote, dreadful. Another leaked document also reveals that Sony's employees were unhappy that the first movie was a reboot. A particularly scathing remark from one employee reads as follows, quote, there is a general blahness to the films we produce. Although we manage to produce an innovative film once in a while, Social Network, Moneyball, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, we continue to be saddled with the mundane, formulaic Adam Sandler films. Let's raise the bar a little on the films we produce and inspire employees that they are working on the next Social Network. That said, there's a strange dichotomy of encouraging us to be fiscally responsible, but then upper management allows certain talent and filmmakers to bleed us dry with their outlandish requests for private jets, wardrobe, and grooming stylists, and are surprised when they are asked to work more than 5 hours to promote their film, end quote. While this remark does not specifically target The Amazing Spider-Man, it does suggest that many of the troubles present in the final product are a result of poor management. As it turned out, Sony executives and employees weren't the only ones disappointed with The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but the star of the movie was upset as well. On September 11, 2014, Spider-Man actor Andrew Garfield vocalized his disappointment with the movie to The Guardian, citing Sony's decision to alter the original script for franchise potential as a major setback. Garfield noted that, quote, when you have something that works as a whole and you start removing portions of it, it's hard to go with the flow of the story, end quote, noting that many of the quote-unquote deep scenes that greatly developed Peter Parker as a character were cut from the film. While Garfield did state that he enjoyed working on the film and noted that his criticism was constructive in nature, these comments did not go unnoticed with the suits at Sony. Of course, the email leaks would later reveal that Garfield's slighting of Sony actually began much earlier. On July 13th of 2014, Garfield was set to attend a public dinner Sony was hosting in Rio de Janeiro during the World Cup. Kaz Hirai intended to give a speech about the company's plans, which would require Garfield's presence for the announcement of an official release date for The Amazing Spider-Man 3. While Garfield arrived in Brazil as planned, he was not dressed for the occasion, and was so embarrassed by the beard that he had to grow for his role in another movie that he canceled his appearance an hour before the presentation. Garfield's cancellation led to Hirai's presentation being hastily altered at the last minute, leading to an embarrassing situation for the company that ultimately led to Garfield being removed from the franchise altogether. This, of course, led to numerous complications regarding how Sony would proceed with the franchise, since the lead had been dropped. The key suggestion being held at the time was that the Sinister Six could serve as a soft reboot of the franchise to justify the introduction of a new actor playing the character. However, Sony seemed to become increasingly unsure of how to proceed, leading to more and more complications with where they were set to take the Spider-Man franchise. There is a lot more to talk about regarding the other creative and financial problems that Sony were facing with the Spider-Man franchise, but we'll continue the discussion in our next video. We will also explore the events that led to the Sony hack and how the fallout of the event affected Spider-Man's cinematic future. If you like this video, please hit that subscribe button. Join us for spin-free news and analysis of the happenings and corporate politics behind the scenes of your favorite genre movies, as well as explorations of your favorite characters and their backgrounds and context here at Midnight's Edge.